subscribe.
Okay, so we're going to get started now. Hi everybody, thanks for coming to this lecture. My name is Gabriel. If you don't know me, I'm one of the lab leaders here, and I coach at Emory. We are going to be talking about topicality today. So can someone tell me, start it off, what kind of argument is topicality? Go ahead. Theory? Yeah, I was going for something else. In this case, it is an off-case position. So you've been introduced to 3 other off-case positions thus far at this camp. We have disadvantages, a couple of disadvantages. We have a counterplan, we have a critique, and now you're going to learn about the final category of off-case position, which is topicality. I'm sure some of you who may have debated before, I'm sure have encountered topicality before. So topicality in its simplest form is an argument that is interpreting the resolution and says that a certain affirmative falls outside of the resolution and thus they should lose the debate. So we'll obviously go over this definition many times over the course of this lecture. But before we get into that, let's think about why we need topicality. So topicality rests on the theory that debate is better, it is more productive, and it is more educational when both sides are prepared. So, all of you have been debating the AI copyright affirmative so far at this camp. You're probably pretty familiar with just like the various ins and outs of the AI copyright affirmative. And when you've been negating that affirmative, you've begun to learn some of the different neg arguments that you can read against that affirmative. So you probably feel pretty good about, if you have to give a 1 in C, a 2 in C against the AI copyright affirmative, you have some things that you can say. You've debated it before, you have an industry disad, you have a politics disad with some links that apply against that particular affirmative. So you have some stuff you could say. If we were to think about a different affirmative, one that falls under a different part of the resolution, like an app that strengthens protections for patents or for trademarks, you'd still have some stuff that you could say because you have some off-case positions, some case arguments that are specific to all intellectual property rights generically. So if you've been over the capitalism critique, there are some parts of that that might be able to apply against an affirmative that is about patents and trademarks but not copyrights at all. But some of the stuff that you've been used to talking about at this camp would not be as applicable because the affirmative is totally different. I think if we had a more extreme example, what if instead of an app that is strengthening intellectual property rights, we had an app that was, for example, weakening intellectual property rights, so maybe getting rid of intellectual property rights altogether? What if we had an affirmative that was about something entirely unrelated to intellectual property rights? Maybe some other just like pro-business regulation that has nothing to do with intellectual property rights. If that were true, you would have much less to say against it. So the point of topicality is to ensure that both sides are prepared by ensuring that both sides fall under the resolution as it's set out at the beginning of the season. So let's take a look at this resolution. I know you probably have, you've definitely talked about this at the topic lecture at the very beginning of camp, but probably haven't been thinking about this as much as we've gotten into the nuts and bolts of just debating one given affirmative. So what are some different parts of this resolution that just stand out to people as important phrases that you think would be, important to think about in terms of defining the boundaries of the topic? So yeah.
Significantly strengthened?
Yeah, so significantly strengthened. That's something that I think that is going to be the focus of a lot of different topicality debates at this camp, right? So we have a phrase, significantly strengthened in the resolution, that is modifying protection of domestic intellectual property rights and indicates that affirmatives both must be significant, i.e. they cannot just strengthen a single copyright in a single area, but must be significantly strengthen all intellectual property rights. And we also have this verb in the resolution, which I think is pretty crucially important, which is strengthen. So, I think throughout the course of the season, many negative teams will be defining what the phrase strengthen means in the context of intellectual property. And it's important to, think about what you want that to mean, both when you're on the negative, and also, make sure that you are defending an affirmative that does strengthen intellectual property rights. Other phrases that in the resolution that seem important to you all. So there were some other hands earlier, but anything else that stands out is something that, yeah.
Protection of.
Yeah, so protection of intellectual property rights. So, we could have various definitions that define which sorts of regulations involving intellectual property are actually involving the protection of intellectual property and aren't just doing other things, unrelated to the protecting of intellectual property. Other phrases, yeah.
Domestic.
Yeah, so domestic, right? There's a lot of intellectual property rights that I guess theoretically exist in terms of international trade. Those things are not part of the topic, right? So the WTO is an organization that sets a lot of international standards. The World Trade Organization is an organization that sets a lot of international standards surrounding intellectual property right. If you put intellectual property rights into Google, you're going to find a bunch of cards that are talking about the World Trade Organization and their various regulations. So the phrase domestic in the resolution is indicating that that is something that should be excluded from the resolution. Any other thoughts on important phrases that are important to think about here? Yeah?
Intellectual property.
Yeah, intellectual property. Intellectual property, I think, is a weird one because, it is modified by the things like the list of intellectual property rights that the resolution gives us. So theoretically, there are intellectual property rights outside of copyrights, patents, and/or trademarks. I mean, those are the big three, but I think you could come up with some other things that are intellectual property, but are not those three things. But yeah, so you have to affect intellectual property rights in one of those three areas. Okay. So I think now we're going to quickly talk about just like the T violation that you will be talking about at this camp, which is this subsets violation that is here. So we're going to talk about this, just briefly go over what is included in this argument, and then we'll talk more concretely about just like what topicality is trying to do, achieve in a debate. So topicality shell has a couple of parts to it. The first one is the interpretation. So an interpretation, I will number these for your viewing pleasure. So an interpretation is usually a piece of evidence, or at least an argument, but usually and ideally a piece of evidence that defines what a certain phrase in the resolution means. So I'll write this up here. So parts of a topicality violation. One, interpretation. Piece of evidence defining a word/phrase in the resolution. So this is pretty obvious, but what words and phrases in the resolution is this 1C shell defining? So we got two of them. Someone just shouted out for me. We have in, yeah, and what's the other one that is being defined here? Rights, exactly. So this violation is defining two phrases in the resolution. So if we go back up to our resolution, we have the phrase in, right? So the resolution mandates that the U.S. strengthen domestic intellectual property rights in copyrights, patents, and/or trademarks. And we have another phrase, which is rights, right? So the phrase domestic intellectual property rights includes the phrase rights. And we have a definition of what the phrase rights means in the context of, not in the context of domestic intellectual property, just in general. So we have a definition of in and a definition of rights. So the first part of a topicality shell is a violation, an interpretation that is a piece of evidence defining what a word and the phrase in the resolution means. Okay. The second part of a topicality violation is the violation, which makes sense. So we use the phrase a topicality violation to refer to just like this, type of argument collectively. So like this whole thing is, collectively a topicality violation. But yeah, so the second part is a violation. And a violation is an argument or a piece of evidence for why the affirmative violates the words that you have defined in the resolution. So in the context of this, we have an interpretation that says that in means throughout, and that rights refers to all rights, right? So the violation in this context argues that the affirmative only strengthens copyright for materials infringed upon by generative AI, so it is not strengthening all copyright protections or regulations or whatever. So the general focus of this topicality violation is arguing that the affirmative has picked a subset of copyright law, i.e. that they've defined one type of copyright infringement, which is that generative AI is training on copyrighted material, and then that is bad, which does not strengthen protections for all things that could be copyrighted. So it is arguing that to be topical, an affirmative must affect all copyright, not just some things that are copyrighted. Right, so violation, the affirmative only strengthens copyright for materials infringed upon by generative AI, which doesn't strengthen all copyright. And last, we have our reasons to prefer, or our reasons to vote negative. So let's say reasons to prefer our interpretation. And we have two arguments here, which are limits and ground. So we'll get into this in a lot more depth in just a second, but limits refers to the argument about the number of cases that exist on the topic, and ground refers to having things to say against different affirmatives, right? So a division of negative ground involves just like having a lot of different arguments that are applicable against a certain type of affirmative. Okay. Cool. So we'll return to this in a second as we get more into it. Reasons. Okay. So let's take a step back and think about why topicality is important more broadly. So I think that there are two arguments that sort of underlie, sort of impact arguments that underlie why we need to have topicality in order to have good debates. So the first thing is predictability and fairness, right? So debate is the most fair. It is the most predictable for both sides. Both sides have the best chance of winning the debate, and the negative team that is responding to a particular affirmative has the best chance of winning the debate when you can predict what your opponent will say and you've practiced it before. So I'll write this up here. Reasons why topicality is important. So these are things that will come up as like impact arguments or internal link arguments in a bunch of different topicality debates. So just like in dissad, or basically any other argument in debate, you are trying to get to an impact, and you're trying to explain why the impact is important in the context of the argument that you're going for. So for topicality, our arguments for why topicality is important usually boil down to one of two things. So we have fairness and we have education. So fairness, I'm trying to think if you've covered this before. You might have touched on it if you've debated just like, framework on a critique or talked about counterplan theory, but you see it all the time in topicality. So fairness is the belief that both sides should have a roughly equal chance of winning the debate. Based on the rules of the game. So fairness is an argument that debate is a game, and that, like all games, they need to operate according to certain rules in order to make it so it is fair, and that both sides have a chance of winning, a roughly equal chance of winning the debate. So like if you're playing a game like Monopoly, it would not be fun if you were playing the game and all of the people that you were playing with just like got some sort of extra bonus to them that ensured that they, like every time they passed go, they got $400 or something, which is much more than you would receive, which would obviously give them a huge advantage and just make it so you're like spending 2 hours playing a game that you were just slowly losing. Nobody would agree to play that game. That's not fun. It's not fair, and it reduces the incentive for you to participate in the activity. So debate has fairness too. If the affirmative was allowed to just like talk about anything that they wanted, you would always be, and you were forced to find things to say to negate them, the debate would be pretty unfair, and you would not learn as much from it. You would not gain as much enjoyment from the activity. It would be pretty tough for the negative. So fairness is one big category of impacts. The second big category of impacts is education. So education is the belief that in order, one of the primary goals of this activity is learning stuff. You all have come to debate camp to learn how to be better at debate, but the reason that you have agreed to do debate is probably because you enjoy it, hopefully. I assume that you do. Or maybe it's because, like your parents wanted you to sign up for this because it's an educational activity that teaches you a lot about the world. But, one of the primary reasons, one of the things that you gain from debate is education. And topicality is important to ensuring that there's good education every year. Second subset of this is that topics change every year for a reason, right? So we've determined that there is value in learning about new things. So last year, you all might have debated, if you debated last year, you might have familiarized yourself with the topic about fiscal redistribution. We determined that's something that's good to learn about, but it's not so good to learn about that we should be debating that every year. There is a belief that it is important to learn about new things every year. So we have changed the topic to domestic intellectual property rights. And that is a topic that everybody has agreed has, there are some good reasons for strengthening domestic intellectual property rights. There are some good reasons against it. And those are things that should be debated and should be learned about over the course of the year. So if an affirmative just totally negates that controversy by talking about something completely unrelated to domestic intellectual property rights, debates would be significantly less educational. So our two impacts, we have fairness and education. Fairness is the belief that debate should be fair for both sides. Education is the belief that debate should be educational, and a stable, limited topic is necessary to learn the most about the topic. So basically every other theoretical argument in debate, topicality revolves around one of these two impacts. So in order to win a debate on topicality, you must win that the affirmative is worse for fairness, and that the affirmative is, or that the affirmative is worse for education. Okay. Let's see. So we have our topicality violation down here. So we have two impacts that we are potentially getting to through these two internal link arguments about limits and ground. And we have our violation down here. So we've read some dictionary definitions of the words in the resolution defining what they mean, and we've made an argument for why the affirmative violates it. So let's talk about some of the different standards or reasons to prefer that exist on topicality. So the two that we've included on this topic, or this particular topicality violation, are limits and ground. So I'll make a new section of my notes here. So we have reasons to prefer up here. So the most common one that you will see, and that is included here, is limits. So limits is the argument that in general, fewer possible topical cases reduces the research burden on the negative, which allows for a greater depth of neg research and therefore produces better and more educational debates. So limits is the belief that fewer topical cases results in deeper research and better debates. So I think that this one is pretty intuitively true. The reason that we have given you a single affirmative to debate at this camp, so no matter what, you are forced to read the AI copyright affirmative. There's no way to get around that fact. The reason that we have made that decision is in part because there's a belief that you learn more from debate when you get practice debating the same thing multiple times, so that you gain a greater experience in how to just best explain the various parts of that affirmative, and you engage with it on a deeper level. So every subsequent debate that you have on the AI copyright app, you probably begin to engage with the affirmative at a deeper level. You think more about different parts of the internal links of the 1AC in a way that you haven't really yet. Maybe you didn't in the first debate that you had on it. So that is sort of evidence of the point of limits, is that fewer cases results in deeper research and in general better debates. Other reasons to prefer, one that you'll see all the time is obviously ground, which is included also in this particular topicality violation. So ground is the belief that there are things that the AF should be able to argue and things that the neg can't argue, right? So the AF is able to garner offense based on proposals to strengthen protection of domestic intellectual property rights in these areas. And the neg is able to garner offense based on saying that strengthening the protection of domestic intellectual property is bad, or that the United States federal government taking a certain action is bad, or that copyrights are bad, that patents are bad, that trademarks are bad. So all the various different, neg grounds on this topic stems from the resolution. And if an affirmative violates a certain part of the resolution, that means that the negative loses access to those arguments. So ground is the belief that there are things that the aff can argue. So the belief that there are things that the aff should argue and that there are things that the neg should be able to argue for. These are two big ones, and they're the ones that we've included here. So the last one, I think, the last really big one that you see all the time is predictability, or sometimes you see something called precision. I think that those are both basically variations on the same argument. So limits is the total number of cases, ground is the sorts of things the team should be able to say on both sides. And the last reason that you could have to prefer a certain definition over another is which definition is the most predictable or the most precise. So certain definitions are very clearly have an intent to define. They are, from the core of the topic literature surrounding intellectual property. And other definitions are sort of arbitrary and just picked out of nowhere. It'll be some random court case from 1920. And it will just be some judge's just interpretation of just what a certain word means out of the context of the topic. So a lot of topicality debates involve questions over which definition or which interpretation of the topic is most predictable or precise. So which definition comes from the most predictable source that is easy to anticipate. And as you can imagine, thinking about which definition or which interpretation is the most predictable is something that is a little bit subjective, right? So if we go back to our specific topicality violation, we have this definition of in that is from a dictionary, right? And you can make a pretty reasonable argument that dictionary definitions are very predictable, right? So if you don't know what a word means and you want a specific definition of it, the place that many people would obviously go is a dictionary. So you would pull out something called Words and Phrases from this book from 2008, you would look up and you'd see what the phrase in means according to that. You can also make an argument that dictionary definitions are not very predictable because instead of defining things through a dictionary, we should define things in the context of the resolution more broadly, right? So we have this definition of in that is fine, but it's talking about this this act that was passed in 1861. That doesn't sound very predictable to me. A better, more predictable definition of the phrase in the resolution might be something that is used in context. So, a piece of evidence defining the protection of domestic intellectual property rights in copyrights, patents, and/or trademarks would be a more predictable definition of the phrase in as it's used in the resolution because, it is used in the context of the resolution itself. Yeah. You see there's a lot of other just standards or reasons to prefer that you can see. I'll say standards here. Sorry, that's a word I've used a couple times. So standards are another word that you'll see for just general reasons that you have to prefer one interpretation over the other. So limits is a standard argument, grounds is a standards argument, predictability, precision, all standards arguments. There are some others that you'll see thrown out there. Sometimes you'll see something called framers' intent, which is the belief that the framers of the resolution had an intention to divide the topic in a certain way, make certain cases topical. Sometimes you'll see arguments that are just purely based on just the sources that are used, although that usually is folded into predictability and precision type arguments. So there's some other things that you'll see thrown around, but if you know these big three, so limits, ground, and predictability, usually you have a pretty good handle on just the different reasons that you could have to prefer one interpretation over the other. Okay. And then the last major part of topicality violation is what are called voters. And this usually, when people say voters, they usually are just talking about two different frameworks for evaluating topicality, right? So, competing interpretations versus reasonability. Yeah, so voters refers to the reason that violating your interpretation is significant enough to justify a negative ballot. So if the negative wins an interpretation, if they win that the affirmative violates that, and then they win some reasons to prefer, so reasons that that interpretation is important for limits, ground, or predictability, they should be able to win the debate. And the part of topicality that argues why they should win the debate is referred to as the voters. And the most common way that you'll see this argument framed for the negative side is the argument, the phrase, competing interpretations. So I'll say, so competing interpretations is the idea that the better interpretation should, whichever team who has the better interpretation for debate, should win the debate. So if we win that this interpretation that we have presented, that in means throughout and that rights refers to all rights, is better for limits, ground, and predictability, the negative should win the debate. So we have established that the affirmative violates their interpretation. We have one reason why it's better. That means the negative should win the debate. That seems pretty straightforward, right? So it's like whichever competing interpretations is the belief that, whichever team has the better interpretation should just automatically win the debate. It seems pretty straightforward in the context of just evaluating topicality. It is usually sort of, I guess, argued against by the main affirmative objection or way to evaluate topicality debates, which is reasonability. So reasonability is the belief that if an affirmative is reasonably topical or if interpretations are reasonably close to one another, that it should not be sufficient to vote negative, and that you should just vote F if there's any disagreement. So the main affirmative objection on the voters' level of topicality is reasonability. Yeah, so I'll write a definition here. So reasonability, the idea that if two interpretations are reasonably close to one another, the affirmative should not lose the debate. So really, reasonability is an argument that you only make when you are on the affirmative. And it's the idea that, the idea that the affirmative should just lose the entire debate and that everything that they have said about intellectual property rights should just be, written off as totally irrelevant if it is slightly distinct from the way that the neg has defined various phrases in the resolution, is a bad model that is sort of anti-educational. It means that we don't, debate about the topic in ways that could be as productive, as if we were a little bit more lenient in terms of defining what the phrases in the resolution should mean. Yeah. So it's you can imagine some good arguments for competing interpretations and some good arguments for reasonability. So competing interpretations is usually preferred because it is much more precise, it's much more, it's much less arbitrary than reasonability. Because it's very, obvious that you can just have a certain interpretation and then, you debate out to determine which interpretation is better. Reasonability is usually viewed as better in terms of protecting just affirmative strategy more generally, right? So things would be pretty bad for the affirmative if the negative could just, get up there and just read a definition that is just slightly more limiting than the things that the ways that the affirmative has defined the resolution, and just argue that they should just automatically win the debate, even if the magnitude of offense is very small. Okay. So, questions about what we've covered thus far. So, like, these are the big, just like, components of a topicality debate. After this, I want to talk about just like some tips for actually debating topicality on the negative and what topicality debates actually look like a little bit. But I'll pause to ask for questions. So, are there any questions about what we've covered thus far? Yeah.
Well, like, you said some of them are internal links and some of them are impact, but which ones are specifically?
That's a good question. So I would think of like these. So, it's like it's kind of vague because like the difference between an internal link and an impact is not very definite. But if we're keeping up the analogy to just like a disadvantage, I would think of limits, ground, and predictability as being your internal link arguments to your impacts, which are education and fairness, right? So the only terminal impacts when we're talking about like theoretical things, in debate you have terminal impacts like nuclear war, like extinction from climate change, stuff like that. In the context of theory, your only terminal impacts in terms of just like debating about debate are usually fairness and education. So every theoretical argument is preferred either because it is net better for fairness, it ensures that both teams have an equal chance, roughly equal chance of winning the debate, or it's net better for education. Which means that like a certain interpretation or a certain way of debating results in more stuff being learned about the topic over the course of the year. So these are your internal link arguments. These are your impact arguments to use the analogy to like this as. Yeah. Did you have a follow-up question or? Yeah.
So, can you get, wait, not a follow-up, just another one.
Mhm.
Can you give like an example of a big justification for a nuclear voter?
Of a justification for making a voter?
Yeah, like on the
I think that all of these like reasons to prefer are sort of your justifications for just like voting one way or the other, right? These two things, so competing interpretations versus reasonability, are sort of just like the different ways that you should think about like impact calculus or think about like how you should weigh various impacts in the topicality debate. But yeah, these internal link arguments, your reasons to prefer, your standards, limits, ground, and predictability are the reasons that you are saying that a certain team should lose the debate in order because they they violate a certain interpretation.
So you'd be like, oh, that's the voter for fairness and education.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Other questions? Yeah.
For grounds, like how do you keep that from being completely self-serving? Like could you just say, if you're the neg, like for the app, like I should be able to make this argument and it's just whatever argument I want.
Yep. That's a great question, and I think the answer is you don't really. It is pretty self-serving, right? So I think that's a little bit of like a flippant response, but it's like at a certain point, ground arguments do sort of sound pretty self-serving because it's like the negative shouldn't be like guaranteed access to just like whatever their favorite just like pet negative argument is, just because the resolution is like written a certain way. So like a lot of times you'll see people being like, oh, like an affirmative that defends the courts is bad because that means that the negative is not able to read the politics DA against it. And it is true that the politics DA is like a really common piece of negative ground that a lot of negative teams read, but there's no inherent reason that the negative should have access to certain arguments just because of, they think that the resolution should look a certain way. So that's like the best response to ground is that it's inherently arbitrary. The best argument in favor of, a division of negative ground that makes sense is usually something along the lines of, some things that we could say to negate this resolution are very straightforward and should certainly be included. So the negative should probably be able to say that like copyrights, patents, and or trademarks are bad and that, the protection surrounding those should be weakened and not strengthened. So whatever is the direct opposite of the topic. And I think almost every judge would agree that that's a pretty reasonable interpretation of just like what should be negative ground on the topic and what should be affirmative grounds. But yeah, it can be pretty self-serving at times. Other questions about what we've covered, what we've gone over so far? Yeah.
When you talk about like the education impact,
Mm-hmm.
would you justify it by providing examples like, oh, increase topic education or like if you're
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable way, and like that's pretty commonly how these debates go. So it's like some interpretations of intellectual property are probably better for learning about like what the core controversy in the literature surrounding intellectual property actually is, and some are probably worse for doing that. So like for the example of the AI copyright app, you could argue that just like, interpreting this like debate about generative AI to be topical and something that should be debated is important because like one of the biggest things that is currently testing our current understandings of the way that intellectual property works is this new technology that is sort of like engaging on copyright infringement in a way that has never really been seen before because the way that AI treats intellectual property is very different from the way that any humans in the past have treated it when they've talked about things like fair use or other things related to copyright law. So yeah, it's pretty easy to come up with an argument for why just like thinking about the topic in a certain way could be important to just garnering more net educational value from that topic. Other questions? Okay, cool. Let's talk about some general thoughts on how you should be debating topicality. So I think that the way that you should be thinking about debating topicality on both negative and affirmative is thinking about T not just as a definition, a question of violating different definitions, but rather thinking about what different models of debate ought to look like. So it can be easy, especially when you're just like learning topicality debates, to get really caught up on just like what these different definitions mean and just like think very just like sort of specifically about like how different phrases in resolution should be defined. But I think it's important to keep in mind when you're debating topicality that topicality is a question of what different models of debate should look like, or the goal of topicality is to illustrate what debate would look like under each interpretation. So if you're debating topicality, if you're giving speeches on it, you are trying to argue for not just that an interpretation that is like better, even though that's an important part of like what you're trying to accomplish, but you're trying to argue more holistically that debate would look better, would be better under your interpretation. And the way that you do that is by illustrating what debate would look like, what sort of arguments different teams would read, what sort of negative objections there would be to those arguments, under a certain definition of the topic. So your goal in topicality debates is to win that your version of the topic is superior to the app's. So let's go back to this, just like topicality violation that we have here. We have a couple of definitions. The 2 and R that I would give on these on these interpretations is not that just like our definition from Words and Phrases 8, our definition from Shodo 19 is just like so much better than the app interpretation. The 2 and R that I would give would be talking about how debate would be much worse. It would be much more difficult for the negative. It would be much less educational if affirmatives were allowed to pick any subset of copyrights, trademarks, and patents and claim that as a sufficient affirmation of the resolution. Instead, debate would be much better if we focus more holistically on affirmatives that modify all copyrights, patents, and/or trademarks, because that would mean that the negative is able to have more in-depth objections to that are focused on the expansion of intellectual property rights being bad. So you want to think about topicality in terms of questions about what different models of debates should look like. Yeah. So the way that you accomplish this is through examples. So there's a couple of different examples that you want to include when you're debating topicality. Let me back this up. So you want examples of affirmatives that would be justified under the affirmative's interpretation of the resolution. So you would want to come up with a list of just like egregious examples of things that would be justified if we were to, use the affirmative interpretation of the resolution over the negatives, right? So the general focus of this violation that we've been looking at is the belief that subsets of copyrights, subsets of patents, subsets of trademarks should not be topical, and that affirmatives must modify all copyrights, all patents, or all trademarks, right? So if I'm trying to argue that this interpretation is better, and I'm trying to persuade a judge that this is true, I would come up with some egregious examples of like what are different ways that you could, like what are specific things that you could talk about copyrights in the context of, and imagine those as possible cases that could exist on the topic. So in this file, there's some different things, some pieces of evidence that are included that are sort of trying to accomplish this. There's one piece of evidence here that is just a list of all the different things that could be copyrighted. And we're using that to argue that affirmatives that are allowed to defend subsets of copyright would force the debate to become about very just like sort of arbitrary and obscure things that don't really teach us about the core controversies surrounding copyright. So you probably can't see this because it's very small, but like some of the things that are listed here, like it's just a long list of things that could potentially be copyrighted. You can copyright photos, you can copyright logos, you can copyright brochures, t-shirt designs, course content. Like there's many, many different things that can be copyrighted. And if you theoretically allow subsets of the resolution to be topical, then theoretically you're forcing the affirmative to debate a case that is saying that we should strengthen copyright protections for poems and song lyrics. And what is your disadvantage to saying that we should strengthen copyright protections for just like poems? Maybe you could come up with some things that potentially apply, but like you probably haven't spent that much time thinking about negating the idea that poems should be, the intellectual property surrounding poems should be strengthened. So it'd be pretty difficult to debate that. And there's a bunch of different things that the affirmative could potentially defend. So you want to come up with a list of examples of affirmatives that would be justified under the affirmative's interpretation of the resolution. And I think that's pretty straightforward given this particular topicality violation in particular, right? So since we're arguing that affirmatives must modify all copyrights, all patents, and all trademarks, you can just come up with, individual things that could be copyrighted, that could be patented or trademarked, and explain how those things are arbitrary and should not be entire affirmative cases that must be debated. Okay. Yeah. The second list that you want to have is robust negative positions that exist under your interpretation, that are guaranteed, rather. Yeah. So we have a list of affirmatives that are justified. So, if this affirmative interpretation of topicality is allowed, the affirmative is forced to debate, the negative is forced to debate the strengthened copyrights for song lyrics F. That's very bad, very hard to negate against. The reason that is bad is because it means that the negative doesn't get access to core negative ground. So, the industry disadvantage, the disadvantage that argues that there are just certain large industries like the AI industry that benefit from there being vast intellectual property rights, obviously does not apply against an affirmative that just strengthens copyrights for poems or strengthens copyrights for song lyrics or something like that. So you'd want to come up with a list of robust positions that are guaranteed under your interpretation. And here, this is where you want to think about what other teams are doing on the topic more broadly. So you list things like the industry disadvantage. There are other disadvantages that I'm sure you haven't thought about much, but were at least mentioned in the topic lecture at the beginning of camp. So there are things like the court clog disadvantage. There are DAs to copyright and patents specifically, etc. So you would just come up with a list of all the different negative positions that exist on the topic and explain why those negative positions lead to productive educational debates. And the last thing that I think is important is coming up with a list of things that the affirmative can say under your interpretation. So I would say robust affirmative cases that exist under your interpretation. So can somebody think, so we have this interpretation that says that that subsets of copyrights, patents, etc. should not be allowed. Can somebody think of a case that would modify all copyrights, all patents, or all trademarks? What is something that we could do to just like make a law that would affect all patents, all copyrights, all trademarks? There's one really like obvious example that comes to my mind, but I want to see if anybody else has thoughts. Yeah.
Devolve power.
You could devolve the power. How would that strengthen copyrights, patents, or trademarks? Seems like it would violate some other stuff. Yeah.
Change how long after an artist dies.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. So things affecting the duration of copyrights, patents, and trademarks is something that you see all the time in the literature. If you put into Google, like, how should copyright be reformed? How should patents be reformed? One of the most common proposals is like strengthen or expand the length that things can be copyrighted for, expand how long copyright protection should be kept after the creator of a certain idea dies, things along those lines, right? So an affirmative that is like, we should change the length of copyright by like 20 years or something, make it longer, would obviously strengthen domestic intellectual property rights, and it would affect all copyrights, not just a subset of, copyright or things that are affected by generative AI. You can do the same thing for patents, you can do the same thing for trademarks. People have other ideas about like reforms that you can make that would affect all copyrights, patents, or trademarks. Yeah?
Change what part of the government does them.
You could. If you had an argument for why that was strengthening intellectual property rights, that would make sense, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe make it easier to file them.
Yeah, that would be a good example. So it's like, you could make an argument that strengthening it, that it's too hard for people to file copyrights now. So like, if there's some way to make it easier to copyright them, that would be a strengthening of intellectual property rights. So stuff like that, yeah.
You also make it easier to qualify to get copyright.
Yeah, exactly. So you can make it easier to like reduce the barrier that it takes to just like receive a copyright, receive a patent, or receive a trademark. Yeah. So like there's a lot of different standards that you have to meet to like qualify for a patent, like obviousness. You have to prove to like the people reviewing the patent that like this invention that you've come up with is not so obvious that somebody should have come up with it already. And yeah, like so maybe changing the obviousness standard would be a plan that would apply to all patents. That would be pretty easy to come up with some core negative objections to. So going back down to what you should be doing when you're debating topicality, you would want to come up with a list that is like, we allow affirmatives that or actually get to the core question about whether or not intellectual property rights should be strengthened. So affirmatives that affect the duration, that affect the standards for qualifying for one of these intellectual property protections, affirmatives that affect how easy it is to file for these various protections, I think would be something that you want to be emphasizing a lot if you're negative and talking about what is allowed under your interpretation. Yeah. Some other thing that you'll see is that this particular one, so robust affirmatives that exist under your interpretation, is referred to as a case list, right? So a lot of times, incensed affirmative teams will be like, can you provide me a case list for what affirmatives exist under your interpretation? And if you're a negative team and you're trying to be good at debating topicality, you should have a case list that is ready to go that seems very reasonable, that the judge is not like going to like laugh you out of the room for making the argument of. So if you have a case list that like is talking about core affirmatives that actually do modify important parts of intellectual property rights, that is much more persuasive than a case list that's just like, oh, our interpretation is basically the same as your interpretation, but your app isn't topical, so you should lose the debate. That seems much more arbitrary, and seems like the focus of topicality is less like trying to improve education and fairness, and more just a negative trying to win the debate because they want an easy way out and don't feel like actually negating the things that the affirmative has said. Okay. All right, let's quickly talk about how to answer topicality on the affirmative. Questions about debating topicality in the negative before I move on to that. So, like different things that you might have encountered when just like thinking about topicality, different things that you need to do as negative in order to win topicality. Okay. Yeah.
Wait, so how do we like extend it so much? Like what parts specifically do you extend out a lot when you're doing a rebuttal about topicality?
You need to extend all of these things when you're, like extending topicality. But I think more explicitly, I think most topicality debates usually devolve into just debates about different standards, right? So reasons to prefer. This argument about just like limits and ground and stuff like that, and especially just like the predictability of various interpretations usually becomes like the core of what the debate is actually about. Because usually, unless the negative has like messed up writing their topicality violation, the violation will be pretty obvious. It'll be pretty obvious that a certain affirmative does not, meet the violation that the negative has come up with. And the interpretation is usually just like pretty straightforward because you're just reading a piece of evidence that says that like, the certain phrase in the resolution means one thing versus another. So most of the debating usually involves like the standards or reasons to prefer. So this part of the topicality debate. Yeah.
And what were you saying about like arbitrary?
Mm-hmm. So like arbitrariness is like the idea that it's not very predictable. It's like sort of subjective. What sort of certain ways of defining the resolution might be more less predictable than others. And when you're affirmative, that is usually just like a very just like core piece of your offense, is that like the way that you've come up with of defining the resolution is like a pretty contextual, a pretty reasonable way of thinking about what the words in the resolution should mean. And that the negatives one is like arbitrary, cherry-picked, something that is a definition that they've just picked to try to win the debate. Okay. Let's talk about debating topicality on the affirmative. So when you're answering topicality in the 2AC, and we have a 2AC down here, so we'll go through this quickly. There's a couple. It's pretty similar. It mirrors the ways that the negative debates it. So parts of a 2AC to topicality / affirmative answers. The first one is always we meet. So we meet is an argument that operates on the interpretation and violation level of topicality debating. And it is an argument that says that the affirmative meets the definition / interp provided by the negative. So against some sort of topicality violations, the we meet argument is very compelling. Against others, it's not very compelling. But I think you should always at least try to make a we meet argument, even if you don't think it's like the best thing in the world. But I think against this violation in particular, you could make a pretty reasonable argument for why the negative does in fact meet this violation. So thinking about our AI copyright app that establishes copyright for AI, or for copyright for licensing or compensation for copyrighted material that is trained upon by generative AI, how would we say that applies to all copyright? And this should be pretty straightforward, yeah.
Well, it can apply to like images, articles,
Right. Exactly. So this list that we went to earlier about all the different things that could be copyrighted, all of these things do, apply under our affirmative, right? The stipulation that is placed by the affirmative is that if these things are infringed upon by generative AI, then the owner of that copyright should be compensated for it. So I think you can make a pretty convincing argument that the affirmative does apply to all copyright, because it says that if generative AI trains on any of the copyrighted materials that somebody owns, that they should be compensated for that. So yeah, So we always have a we meet argument that is connected to, that is sort of just like contesting the violation that the negative has presented. So we meet. Second, you need a counter interpretation. So the negative has read an interpretation that is defining certain phrases in the resolution. It is imperative. Every 2AC must do this. Every 2AC must give a counter definition of what the different phrases in the resolution are, right? So we have this counter interpretation that says that in means within, and that rights include any entitlement to something. So the 1 in C has defined the phrase in, meaning throughout, and rights referring to all rights. And the affirmative has contested that with a counter interpretation that says in does not mean throughout, it actually means within, and that rights does not refer to all rights, but rather is just any general entitlement to something. So go back up. So the counter interpretation, every 2AC should counter define every word that is defined by the negative. So this means that if you are an affirmative team and you do not want to lose debates on topicality, it is important to have just a counter definition of basically every word in the resolution that could possibly apply to your plain text, right? So you might not need a counter definition of like United States federal government because that's pretty straightforward. But if you're like on the margins of just like copyright, patents, and/or trademarks, you would want a definition of what these things mean that is very broad, that your affirmative at a minimum definitely falls, definitely meets, right? So it's important to have a broad definition of what strengthened means. It's important to have a broad definition of what domestic intellectual property rights means, that your affirmative definitely falls under, right? Because it's crucially important, I want to emphasize again, that the affirmative must counter-define every phrase that the negative has defined. Otherwise, they're going to be in a pretty tough spot because there's a word that the negative has defined that is uncontested, and if the affirmative doesn't meet that interpretation, then that's usually pretty easy for the negative to win that debate. So we have a we meet, we have a counter interpretation. The last thing, just like the negative has, we have our standards or reasons to prefer. So this is just the same as debating it on the negative. It's just usually flipped around. So you'll see the same sorts of just like arguments about just like limits, ground, and predictability, except the way that the affirmative is construing the way that these arguments play out is usually obviously more in favor of what the affirmative wants to defend. So I think the most important standard that you'll see when debating topicality for the affirmative side is something along the lines of like AF innovation or AF predictability or over-limiting. So over-limiting is sort of the opposites of limits, right? So the negative has argued that a more limited topic is intrinsically better for debate. Over-limiting is the belief that it is possible to write a resolution that is too limited. That means that debates would become stale. We would not learn as much from debates, and that it is better to allow some sort of flexibility in the sorts of things that affirmatives are able to defend. So going back to our packet example. How many people are interested in reading an affirmative that is not AI copyright during the season? Okay, get some hands. Basically everybody is interested in saying something that is not this app that has been defended so far at the Andy. And I understand where you're coming from. I kind of agree. Debate would be pretty boring if you only had one choice of which affirmative to defend and you just had to read the same advantages and the same just like plain text over the course of the year. So yeah. I think that if the negative has an interpretation that is only that AI, interpretation only AI copyright is topical, everything else is not topical. If the affirmative says anything else, they should lose the debate. I think it would be pretty easy to sell a judge that that is an over-limiting interpretation of what the resolution should be. Not only is it arbitrarily excluding the other parts of the resolution, but it would be pretty boring if debate was just only about one affirmative and not, talking about various affirmatives over the course of the season. Yeah, and connected to overlimiting is the idea that affirmation is a good thing. So, affirmative innovation, just like what we talked about, is the belief that affirmatives should innovate over the course of the year. So like the affirmative that you read at the first tournament of the year is ideally not the same affirmative that you read at the last tournament of the year, because as the topic has evolved, you found better ways to interpret the resolution, better areas to cover. And over the course of the year, you learn about many different parts of the resolution as opposed to just fixating on one affirmative plan the whole year. So that's one big piece of offense. The other big piece of offense is affirmative predictability, or aff predictability. You almost always, as affirmative debating topicality, want to argue that your interpretation is more predictable than the negative's interpretation. And I think in general, if you have written a certain affirmative and you think that it's topical, like you probably have come up with a more predictable interpretation than the thing that the negative will throw at you. So thinking about this interpretation here, in means throughout. Most people, the most common sense definition of the word in is obviously not throughout, right? If we look at like what this card is actually talking about, we'll see that it's talking about some act from 1861 that says that the justices of peace shall have jurisdiction in their respective countries to hear and determine the complaints. And we are construing the word in to mean throughout, right? So we're talking about some geographic definition of the word in that obviously does not grammatically refer to the same in that the resolution is talking about, which is in the area of copyrights, patents, or trademarks. So you could say that although this interpretation is defining what the phrase in means, it is not the most predictable interpretation that we could have imagined about what the phrase in should mean. We go down to the affirmative in interpretation, and we have this definition that seems much more predictable. In fact, it's so predictable that we have a piece of evidence saying that it is the core meaning of what the phrase in means. And it says that in means within or inside something. So an affirmative that affects copyright does not have to, it has to fall within things that can be copyrighted, but it does not need to affect all copyright, at least as far as the phrase in is concerned. So you almost always want to argue that your interpretation is more predictable. And if you look at like the evidence that is included in this packet, you have some evidence. There's some evidence that supports the argument that that this definition of in, the affirmative one, in meaning within, is a more predictable interpretation of what the topic should be. We got this card that is like a court case that says that the court found that one definition of in was like extremely arbitrary. We have like another court interpretation that is like closely tied to the dictionary definition, etc. So you almost always want to argue that your interpretation is more predictable, and that that means that it is thus better to debate about. So this is closely tied to precision, right? The more precise definition of a certain phrase in the resolution should be preferred. It's pretty easy to imagine how just like, you can have a more precise definition of in that is included in like the context of the phrase domestic intellectual property rights in copyrights, patents, and/or trademarks, etc. Yeah, let's see what else I have. Okay. So, and then, the affirmative also gets all the different negative arguments, all the different arguments we've already talked about in the context of the negative side, just flipped. So, you can make ground arguments that are just like, that say that the affirmative should be able to have certain things. You can make limits arguments that are like tied to this idea of over-limiting. Predictability arguments. You can make arguments about the quality of sources for both sides, things like that. And then, to the affirmative. Okay. Then quick, the last thing that the affirmative needs to do is say reasonability. So we covered this a little bit earlier, but every affirmative 2AC on topicality needs to include a reasonability argument. So reasonability, again, is the idea that if two interpretations are reasonably close to one another, the affirmative should not lose the debate, right? So you should think about that as like a competing mode of impact calculus for thinking about topicality, right? So, you know, I think it would be pretty difficult to argue that like if you are debating a disad and the disadvantage that you have presented against the affirmative plan is that, you know, it costs, you know, maybe you have, say you have a counter plan that just like solves the entire affirmative case, but saves $1 over the course of a year. It would be pretty difficult to argue that this is like an objection to, like a core objection to the case that the affirmative has presented, if there's just like one way to save $1 that the affirmative might have missed. It would be pretty difficult to argue that that's a reason that the affirmative should be rejected on the whole. And reasonability debates and topicality sort of work in a similar way. When you're arguing for reasonability, you would be arguing that, you know, if you have an interpretation that is slightly more limited or has slightly better ground, but is largely the same as the one that the affirmative has presented, that should not be grounds for the affirmative to lose the debate. So like everything that the affirmative has said, defended about intellectual property, just like totally goes out the window if there's like just an interpretation that is slightly different, slightly more limited, has slightly better ground, etc. So reasonability argues that, you know, when it's kind of close, when there's like some, you know, we all have agreed that we have two definitions that are pretty similar to one another, that the affirmative should not lose the debate. And the reason that you see reasonability being justified is an argument that it is usually along the lines of substance crowd out. And that's just what it sounds like. So substance crowd out is the idea that allowing the negative to win the debate for having a slightly more limited or slightly better interpretation is problematic because it creates an incentive for negative teams to get really good at debating and researching topicality instead of debating and researching the topic, right? So everybody agrees that if the affirmative gets up there and says something about that is not about intellectual property at all, that they should probably lose the debate because it's not topical. But it's a harder sell to say that just like an affirmative that like is certainly about intellectual property rights, but just, you know, is slightly different from the way that the affirmative has defined the phrase in the resolution. That, you know, that affirmative should be entirely excluded just because it is slightly more limited for the negative. If that were true, then there would be an incentive for negative teams to just like, you know, research topicality arguments that just exclude the affirmative and find a definition of copyright that includes everything except for one particular affirmative, and then just have every debate on it. So reasonability exists so every debate does not devolve into questions about topicality, just so the negative is able to just like get an easy ballot by coming up with a violation or an interpretation and resolution that the affirmative violates. So I'll put my reasonability definition back here. Questions about that? Yeah?
Can you go over affirmation again, please?
Yeah, so affirmation is something that you see a lot. Is it in this? It's sort of over here in this 2AC that I've provided to you. But affirmation is the idea that the affirmative, the things that the affirmative should say should change over the course of a season, right? Meaning that, you know, the affirmative always has to defend just like domestic intellectual property rights, like the strengthening of rights. But, you know, as the topic goes on, we should find new and novel ways to think about different ways that we could strengthen intellectual property rights in through areas set up by the resolution. And that it's important to have a slightly less limited version of the topic so that, you know, the things that the affirmative says changes over the course of the year, and we look at intellectual property rights from multiple angles. Yeah. Other questions about things that we've been over? Yeah, we can go over this topicality, this 2AC, in a little bit more depth if that would be useful. So like the arguments that we've provided, we have an aff-ground argument, which is sort of tied to these arguments about over-limiting, aff-innovation, etc. So, you know, if it's true that affirmatives could only modify all copyrights, all patents, or all trademarks, that means that there's basically like, you know, 3 general like categories of cases, or 3 cases that could be read. You know, the affirmative is always trying to be a little bit just like, you know, sort of make a straw man of negative interpretations to some extent. So obviously there are more than 3 ways that you can modify those 3 areas. But it is true that just like, you know, every affirmative would have to apply to all copyrighted patents or trademarks things, which would be a much more limited number of cases, which would harm AFGround and potentially make debates about less things, make them more stale, and reduce the incentive for research. We have this precision argument. So there is a court case that has found, you know, this definition of in to be the most obvious meaning. So there's another piece of evidence supporting the definition that is proposed by the negative. That's something we should talk about. We have this argument about functional limits. So functional limits, and I'll put this up here in my list of things that the affirmative needs to include. Functional limits is an important defensive argument that says that there are things that the negative is guaranteed to be able to say against every affirmative that make certain very arbitrary small cases not viable. That there are things that the neg can say against any affirmative that make certain cases not viable. So to give an example of this, an affirmative that, let's say, to go back to our list of just like various things that could be copyrighted, an affirmative that only just like changes copyright law for blog posts would probably not be an affirmative that anybody would actually read over the course of the year, because it would be impossible to find an advantage for why the copyright surrounding blog posts must be changed that, you know, is anything substantive at all. And on the flip side, it would be very easy to just read a generic argument like the capitalism K or the politics dissad that just like says that no, we should not actually pass a whole piece of legislation in Congress that changes the copyright surrounding blog posts, because, you know, having Congress pass a bill that like, you know, changes the agenda and changes the different things that are going on in Congress just to save whatever important standard that the app has come up for why we must, for why like blog posts need to be protected more, would obviously lose the politics dissad or the capitalism critique or something like that. So functional limits is an argument that, you know, many of the extreme examples of things that would be justified are not actually viable cases that would win debates, which means that functionally the interpretation presented by the affirmative is not unlimited and would have some serious constraints on the sorts of cases that are viable. Does that make sense? Somewhat? Okay. Cool. So going back to our 2AC, we have a functional limits argument that it's just listing off some stuff that exists on the topic. The court's kind of plan, the state's kind of plan, the politics, are all reasons why, you know, that these extreme cases that the negative is coming up with are not actually viable. And then we have a reasonability argument. And this is sort of just what we were talking about earlier with substance crowd out, and how reasonability means that any risk of topicality offense is not sufficient reason to vote negative. Okay. The last 2 things that I want to go over quickly are just other phrases that you see in the context of topicality. So 2 other things that are important to think about are affects topicality and extra topicality. And these are sort of neither here nor there because they're arguments about the affirmative or negative could make. Extra topicality and affects topicality. So extra topicality is an argument that the affirmative has said some things that are indeed topical. So if you're debating the AI copyright F, you know, that includes a component that is obviously topical. Imagine if you read an affirmative that was like, we should expand protections for copyrighted material that is trained upon by generative AI. And also, we should establish a universal basic income to support artists who are affected by generative AI. It's pretty obvious that a part of that F is topical, right? So it includes something that is under the topic. There's a component of that is involving intellectual property rights. But the other part that is like establish a universal basic income for artists is extra topical, right? So it takes some action that is topical and then also some action that falls outside of the topic. So extra topicality is an argument that there are some topical components of a given proposal and some non-topical components. And you can imagine that this becomes an issue when you sort of dive into the literature and see that there are a lot of proposals that do not align exactly with resolution, right? So like if you go to Google and just be like, Google like how to save artists like copyright or artists from having their copyrighted material infringed upon by generative AI, you would probably see just like a bunch of different reforms that should take place that are related to intellectual property, but are sort of just like outside of the very strict bounds that are set out by the resolution for the purpose of debate. So you might see proposals about just like changing antitrust laws. You might see other proposals like a universal basic income for artists to protect them from generative AI, stuff like that. So like extra topicality, like that example that I gave, like seems obviously like containing some non-topical components to it. But in the literature, I think the line is a lot less like clear than the one that I'm establishing now. And there are a lot of proposals that contain some topical elements and some non-topical elements. And if your plan text just reads some proposal from somebody on the internet who's not thinking about the context of debate, there might be extra topical components. And extra topicality exists to identify which components of a proposal are topical and which ones are not, and argues that if the affirmative defends things that are outside of the resolution, that they should lose the debate. And then the other one is effects topicality. So effects topicality argues that the effects of the plan are topical, but the action that is mandated by the plan text is not. So think about this. If you write an affirmative that is like pass some law that currently exists in Congress to help AI copyright, or just like help copyright law stand up in the face of AI. There's a lot of laws that currently exist out there. If the plan text says just like pass this law, the mandate of the plan is not like strengthening intellectual property rights. It's not just like actually fulfilling the things in the resolution that we've outlined up here. The mandate of the plan is just to pass a certain law that is like, may or may not be related to intellectual property rights. That's an example of an affirmative that might have effects that are topical. So like an effect of that would be just like, there is increased copyright protections for different creators that are affected by AI, but it's not a mandate that is or something that results from the plan. So this is why like you often see just like affirmatives that like do talk about some act in Congress and might cite certain parts of that, but the plan text is always like some phrase that is derived from the resolution. So like, there's this AI Transparency Act that has been proposed in Congress. The plan text that is written in this packet is not pass that law. It is strengthened intellectual property rights by requiring licensing for copyrighted AI, for generative AI that trains on copyrighted material. So the reason that is true is because you always want to just like sort of define the phrases like a subset of resolution in your plan text and not just like pick other things that exist. Otherwise, it's likely that you'll be effects topical, only effects topical and not directly valuable. Okay. Cool. Well, that's mostly what I have. We need to leave some time to take the indie camp picture. But we have a couple of minutes. So questions about topicality, things that have not been covered yet, ways that topicality might like play out in debates that you have questions about. Really, any other remaining questions that people have about topicality? Yeah?
What do you think is smart to extend in the linear if they extend the key to the block?
That's a good question. So like these are all the things that need to be in the 2AC. I think that the 1AR should always extend a counter interpretation no matter what, and then extend just like go in depth on just like one reason to prefer that your interpretation is better. So you would want to, go in depth on just like one of your reasons to prefer, and then the majority of the speech would be spent explaining why that reason to prefer outweighs what the reasons that the negative has presented. So if you were to give a 1 AR on this T violation, you would like spend a lot of time explaining how aft ground outweighs limits, and then spend a lot of time explaining how you know, like you actually do have an interpretation that is better for aft ground, and that, you know, there's tons of reasons like functional lengths that means that we shouldn't be super worried about these extreme examples that the negative has presented. So I would say you want to extend your counter interpretation always, extend one reason it's better, and then you usually also want to just like include reasonability just to like keep it alive somewhere in the debate. You don't usually want to be in a position where you have totally conceded reasonability, because it's sort of like your sort of hedge against just like, you know, the negative very narrowly winning that their interpretation is better, and that meaning that you should lose. Other questions about various things related to topicality? Yeah.
Not exactly related to topicality,
That's good.
but can we have this document so I can see the descriptions of what all this stuff is?
Sure, I can send this out,
Because
yeah.
I debate with topicality stuff a lot, but sometimes I hear like some of these terms and don't actually remember what they mean.
Okay, yeah, I'll send this out after this lecture then.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other topicality questions or questions about this lecture? Cool. All right, if there's nothing else, then I think we're going to take a group picture outside. I don't know if we
Soundstripe.